Hey everyone, this is Adrian, welcoming you back to Weird Tales from El Paso. As you can probably already hear, we're starting things off a little differently today. I'm currently recording this in my car on my way back home from an interesting, and honestly pretty spooky, evening in Las Cruces, New Mexico, a great little town about 47 miles northwest of El Paso, Texas. And like El Paso, and most other southwestern towns for that matter, Las Cruces has its fair share of paranormal weirdness and fascinating history. Few places in town live up to that reputation like the old Doña County Courthouse and Jail, one of the city's most paranormally active hotspots, and the place I just spent my evening. With a history filled with corruption, crime, and outright tragedy, it's no wonder there may be something still lingering inside those abandoned walls. So welcome to part 1 of a special 2-part episode on the old Doña County Courthouse and Jail. Before we dig into the paranormal, we need to first take a look at a few key moments in Las Cruces and courthouse history. Events that shaped the courthouse's dark legacy and set the stage for the hauntings that followed. We'll be touching upon scandals, the corruptive nature of organized crime, the brutal conditions inside the jail, and a crime that shook the city of Las Cruces to its core. Helping us unpack all this are Luis Arias, a former FBI analyst and current assistant professor of practice at the University of Texas at El Paso's Department of Criminal Justice and Security Studies, and Weird Tales regular Ramiro Galvan from Paranormal Research Investigations in El Paso, Texas. Then, in part 2, once we've laid out the history, we'll dig into the paranormal side of things by chatting with David Kreider, owner and founder of Southwest Expeditions and the current caretaker of the old Doña County Courthouse and Jail. And here's a fun fact. Weird Tales from El Paso is the first ever podcast to record inside the jail walls. It's pretty cool, right? And make sure you stick around, because at the very end, I'll be sharing details about my time at the jail, including some scary and unexplainable audio that we captured during the production of these episodes. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss these. Once again, I'm Adrian Mesa, and you're listening to Weird Tales from El Paso. A beautiful and striking building standing in the heart of downtown Las Cruces, the old Doña County Courthouse and Jail, or the Grand Old Lady as it's known to some, was once a symbol of progress in the area. Now, it looms dark and abandoned, its imposing bone-white exterior serving as a reminder of the city's darker, more complicated history. Over the years, it has become a magnet for ghost hunters and history buffs alike, all drawn to the countless stories that echo throughout its many rooms and cell blocks. The courthouse and jail first came to life in 1937 as part of President Roosevelt's Works Progress Administration, or the WPA for short, a New Deal agency tasked with a nationwide effort to create jobs and boost the economy during and after the Great Depression. Designed by El Paso architect Percy McGee, the structure sports a beautiful Spanish Revival design and was built to last, featuring a strong steel and concrete construction and spanning an impressive 37,000 square feet. The first 2 floors housed county offices and courtrooms, as well as a judge's office, or chamber, while the 3rd floor served as a county jail, which was originally designed to hold 54 prisoners. Officially, the holding area was divided into sections for federal, county, women, and juvenile prisoners, but in reality, they were all crammed into one large, subdivided cage, separated only by bars. The 3rd floor jail also housed a few solitary confinement cells, along with an adjacent insane room, meant for mentally ill or disturbed individuals. And like most jails, overcrowding quickly became an issue, with sometimes more than 100 people being crammed into this cage at a time. Keep this in mind for later. And finally, in 1969, an additional jail annex was added to the building, adding another 18,500 square feet to the building's already impressive footprint. Despite its beginnings as a symbol of progress, this courthouse and jail, perhaps like all good ghost stories, took a dark turn, becoming infamous for something else entirely: corruption, crime, abuse, and so many other unspeakable atrocities, many of which can be traced back to one man, Sheriff Alfonso Happy Apodaca. While today Las Cruces is a friendly and thriving community known for its many weekend markets, vibrant art scene, and stunning views of the Organ Mountains, things looked very different in the 1940s. Back then, organized crime had taken control of New Mexico, including Las Cruces. The Chicago and Cleveland mobs were calling the shots, bribing politicians, judges, and law enforcement in their efforts to turn New Mexico into a gambling hotspot. Corruption spread like wildfire, seeping into every corner of the state, including the walls of the courthouse and jail, where Apodaca ruled with unquestionable authority.
When jails, when prisons were early in America, the court, and the Supreme Court for that matter, took sort of what we call the hands-off attitude, meaning if things happen in prisons, the court didn't really get involved for the reasons that they allowed or saw that the warden was sort of the executive there and he or she was responsible for taking care of those issues.
Meet Luis Arias, a former FBI analyst and current assistant professor of practice at the University of Texas at El Paso's Department of Criminal Justice and Security Studies.
Well, it is a prestigious position to obviously be a warden or be in charge of a jail, be in charge of a prison, like a sheriff's officer is an elected public official to oversee a jail. Obviously, he or she runs on the premise of being a person of good moral character and upholding the law and so on and so forth. But somewhere along the line, people, I guess, lose the compass, the moral compass of doing their job for the right reasons. Obviously, what happens in the community, if it's, gone to those extremes, what's to prevent that environment to also creep in and become part of the culture of a jail? It's a microcosm of what we see in society. And so we just have it within confined walls and all of that happening there.
To say that Happy was a corrupt sheriff would be an understatement. Not just turning a blind eye to the crimes and illegal activities happening around him, but actively participating in them. There are stories of him breaking into homes to collect debts, terrorizing families, and committing even darker acts behind the jail's locked doors. One disturbing account comes from a woman who, as a young girl, was locked up on the third-floor jail for stealing, sharing a cell with several other older women. She recalled one particular night during her stay when, at around 2 a.m., the guards mysteriously disappeared. Moments later, Sheriff Apodaca and 2 of his deputies arrived. According to her account, they dragged some of the older women out of their cells against their will, only to return them hours later, disheveled and sobbing. While it's difficult to confirm the full extent of Apodaca's actions in service to the mob, there were persistent rumors that he was supplying women from the jail to the mob parties that frequently took place at the time. For what purposes, you can probably imagine. The young girl also recalled how the older women would push the younger ones to the back of the cell, trying to shield them from being taken.
I think one would have to maybe question that person's soul. Obviously, that kind of behavior is reprehensible, and today, though, people will be sued, and wardens will face justice as to corrections officers maybe permitting drugs to come into a facility or having inappropriate sexual contact with females, what have you. So again, moral compasses of people maybe get skewed and they forget what their function is as a warden, as a correctional officer, as someone working in a jail, in a prison. Even though that person is an inmate, it's still that person is a human being.
There's no telling how many crimes Apodaca ignored or directly took part in during his reign. In a city consumed by corruption, he was untouchable. That is until March 31st of 1949. That day marked the beginning of the end for much of the state and city's mob-fueled corruption, all sparked by the disappearance of a 19-year-old waitress named Ovida Kugler, or Cricket, as she was better known as.
There was an unfortunate incident that occurred there in Las Cruces, the murder of a young girl named Cricket Kugler. Ovida Kugler is her name, but he nicknamed her Cricket.
This is Ramiro Galvan, an independent paranormal investigator and founder of Paranormal Research Investigations, PRI, in El Paso, Texas.
Cricket basically disappeared in 1949, and her mother reported her missing 10 days later to the sheriff. They found her half buried in a grave on the outskirts of town. Now, normally most people would have thought, oh, it was probably a crime of passion or something like that. However, there is a lot of things there that started happening that the people of Las Cruces kind of rose up and started petitioning. And as a result, a grand jury was convened, and the grand jury found that the sheriff of Apodaca, who was running the jail at that time, they found all sorts of things that, weren't being done correctly. Numerous instances where he turned a blind eye to illegal gambling establishments, discrepancies when they did his financial audit of the jail, things that he didn't follow up on when it came to evidence. There was stories that came out that when they found the body of Cricket, he didn't seal off the crime scene. He didn't look for evidence. He didn't look for clues. And there was a couple of kids that actually found her body in the desert. They reported later that when Sheriff Apodaca showed up, he drove his car over the grave not once, but twice. He then later on convinced the mother to bury Cricket without having an official autopsy. The people of Las Cruces got fed up, and they had a grand jury inquisition. They brought 54 charges against Apodaca. Guess what? All but one of the charges was dismissed, and that was where he tortured a gentleman named of Wesley Bird. And the gentleman reported during the grand jury trial that he had been taken and beaten in the jail and then taken to where Cricket's body had been found, and he was beaten and tortured there, and they put a bicycle lock around his testicles in order to try to coerce a false confession from him. Of course, he didn't do it. So Apodaca basically was convicted of violating the civil rights of one gentleman. And he served a year in La Tuna Federal Penitentiary. And then after that, guess what? He became a judge in Las Cruces.
Cricket Kugler's disappearance and murder wasn't just a tragedy. It was also the moment that exposed the city drowning in corruption and sparked a wave of outrage from its citizens, setting the stage for change. I like to think that Sheriff Apodaca saw the writing on the wall. His actions throughout the case made it clear that he and his department were in full-blown damage control mode, desperate to bury the truth and protect the powerful men they answered to. And according to some sources, that even included New Mexico Lieutenant Governor Joseph Manuel Montoya, whose name had been linked to Cricket's death. Part of that damage control involved finding someone to pin the crime on, and in Apodaca's desperation, that could have been anyone. As Ramiro mentioned earlier, one of their prime targets was Wesley Bird, a black construction worker who was arrested and thrown into isolation for 12 days in the third-floor jail. While locked away, Bird endured endless abuse, both psychological and physical, all in an effort to force a false confession. But he wasn't the only scapegoat. Surprisingly, Pittsburgh Steelers player Jerry Newsom was also arrested, though his treatment was noticeably different, being a white man, of course. Newsom, who was seen speaking to Cricket the night she disappeared, spent 10 days in the jail under quote-unquote voluntary incarceration without any real or actual charges, which Apodaca later explained was meant to help investigators with the case. Somehow. Eventually, Newsom was cleared and returned to Pittsburgh, but the fallout of the case and his time in Las Cruces haunted him for the rest of his life. But that's another story. Though the arrests of both Bird and Newsom were nothing more than a show, the details of their time at the Doña Ana County Jail did hint at some of the other horrors happening behind the jail walls.
When Apodaca was sheriff there, there's an article where he says that he had a suspect that he was questioning, and he described it as vigorous questioning, and that his questioning went from 10 a.m. in the morning to midnight that same day. There was another gentleman there, Lauren Welch, and he said he was tortured in the jail. He said that they had put a bag over his head, and they would put water over his head, kind of like the original waterboarding type technique, and that he was beaten with bats.
While Las Cruces began to settle down in the aftermath of the Cricket Kugler case, the horrors inside the jail were far from over. Even after Apodaca was removed as sheriff, his legacy of corruption lingered, long after his death in 1981.
overcrowding was always an issue there. But the more prisoners they housed, the more prisoners they fed, the more money they got.
There are instances of, again, prisons, jails, because of lack of space, where there is a cell block that would house maybe 4 beds. They now have 10 inmates in that cell block. Well, you can't imagine the anxiety and just violence that could lead from just those quartered spaces. I mean, I can't imagine human beings locked up, put into that kind of situation, but it exists.
The thing about that jail is that back then they didn't have what we have now, which are guidelines on how to house juveniles. And these are juveniles that, in many instances, based on the articles that I've seen and read, is that they weren't picked up for, hardcore crimes. These were kids that were picked up for maybe stealing a bicycle or maybe doing some vandalism somewhere, breaking something and then running away. So they were picked up and taken to this jail, and they were housed in the same area where they had the more hardcore prisoners as well. The federal prisoners were not considered high-risk prisoners, meaning they were basically illegal immigrants. The county prisoners, though, on the other hand, they had everything ranging from misdemeanors to the more serious crimes like murder. In that area, too, they also had what they call solitary confinement. And those were described in a newspaper article back in 1940s as cork-lined and lightless. No toiletries in there whatsoever. If you're a prisoner or you get picked up and you have mental health issues and they put you in one of these cells, what is that going to do to you? Is that going to help you get better or not?
Small children arrested for petty crimes, like the young girl who witnessed Apodaca dragging women away for the mob parties. Non-violent offenders, the mentally ill, and dangerous criminals, all packed into the same small, poorly ventilated space, separated only by a few bars, but all within eyesight of each other. Add to that the void-inducing solitary confinement cells, where Wesley Bird was forced to endure 12 days of isolation and torture, and it's not hard to see how things got so ugly inside the jail. But it wasn't just the overcrowding or abuse that made the conditions unbearable. The third-floor jail was a filthy, sweltering cesspool, plagued by extreme temperatures, poor sanitation, and lacking even the most basic amenities. When the grand jury investigating the Cricket Kugler case inspected the jail on June 7, 1949, they described it as dirty, with a majority of the plumbing clogged or out of order, with many cells without light bulbs, filthy mattresses that reeked of quote-unquote obnoxious odors, and solitary confinement cells that were deemed unsafe and drenched in their own unbearable stench. And despite these damning findings, the situation barely improved, if at all. Children were still mixed in with the adult offenders until the Children's Code was enacted in 1971. But the pattern of cruelty and abuse didn't stop, even with the addition of the jail annex in 1969. The annex added 2 new cell blocks, each designed to hold 36 prisoners under normal conditions, along with 4 juvenile cells, a separate section for women, and 16 close custody cells for the most dangerous or disturbed individuals, affectionately called Murderer's Row by the Southwest Expeditions team. A small exercise yard was built as well, but the same legacy of overcrowding, filthy mattresses, clogged and overflowing toilets, poor ventilation, sweltering summer heat, and relentless cruelty remained. Another disturbing claim comes from a former inmate who recalled a particularly violent month during his incarceration when 3 prisoners were fatally shanked. The story goes that the coroner was delayed for several days, so the guards ordered the bodies to be wrapped in saran wrap and stored in the walk-in cooler, right alongside the food, which the kitchen staff continued to use and eat. There's no official record of this, but given everything else we've covered, would it really be that hard to believe? And if something this horrific was only passed down through word of mouth, imagine how much more went on inside the jail that was never recorded or documented at all. That thought alone is as chilling as any ghost story. On a personal note, during my visit to the jail, I try to imagine the now empty cells and rooms as they would have been when the jail was still in use. These small, filthy spaces with mysterious stains on the walls, the air thick with neglect, and no windows to let in light. I couldn't even begin to fathom what it must have been like to live in these conditions, surrounded by constant noise, overcrowding, and an overwhelming sense of anger and hopelessness. No matter how much time has passed or what changes were made, the old Doña Ana County Courthouse and Jail remained a place where despair was built into its very foundation. And nothing reflects that better than a truly horrific crime that took place inside the jail in 1976. A crime that involved two 15-year-old runaway girls from Oregon who would become victims of something disgustingly abhorrent.
In 1976, a lawsuit was filed in Oregon federal court with the alleged statutory rape of two 15-year-old girls that were held in Doña County Jail. They said that the jailer, Armando Lazarin, he allowed two prisoners, in return for money, which at that time was $50, access to the girls' cells. He actually handed them the keys and allowed them to go in there so they could rape these two girls. But the girls also identified the jailer as participating in the rape itself. Some people have said, well, no, he was just allowed him access in there. No, the girls have said, they testified that he was also a willing participant in there. Now, here's the scary part. Two inmates that were involved. One of them was called, his name is, or was at that time, Raymond, nicknamed Topper Hamilton Jr., 21 years old. He was in jail for killing his 17-year-old ex-wife and his ex-mother-in-law, 42. He shot them to death. The other, he was being held in jail for burglary. They filed charges against those two guys, and the local courts dismissed the rape charges because they were already under indictment. The jailer was convicted of statutory rape, but guess what? He was placed on probation. Now, at that time, Sheriff Tony Gonzalez said, no, we're going to appeal the decision. We believe it was in the wrong, they made the wrong decision there. But another employee that was also there but was not involved in any of the rapes was what they call a jail matron. Her name was Elsie Ramirez. And she was terminated because the charges were she allegedly violated jail procedures which allowed the rape incidents to occur because she failed to make inspection of the female facilities at the jail for every 30 minutes and for releasing the key to the jailer rather than making the inspections as required. The matron said in the 7 years of working at the jail, she was never told it was policy to make inspections every 30 minutes. And she said the key to the facilities was not in her possession that night and never was. She explained that the keys were all kept in the jail booking area, and all jailers have access to them and to any part of the jail, including female section. So that means that if that's the case, any jailer, anybody there working there, would have had access because they would have access to any of the keys there.
Based on the limited information I could find regarding the aftermath of the case, the young woman who filed the lawsuit was awarded $250,000 in damages. As for Raymond Hamilton Jr., or Topper as he was known, he was eventually transferred to the penitentiary of New Mexico to serve out his life sentence for murdering his ex-wife and ex-mother-in-law. He died at the young age of 35 in 1989. And despite some efforts, I couldn't uncover much more about the circumstances surrounding his death. But here's where things get interesting. Although Topper's life ended in a different prison, that may not necessarily mean it was the end of his story at the Doña Ana County Courthouse and Jail. But more on that a little later. The courthouse and jail saw use throughout the 1980s, but starting in the 90s, up to its abandonment in 2008, the building mainly served as county office space as needed and as storage. By the time the courthouse was fully vacated, the building's declining condition made it clear it was no longer practical for continued use. But as the old saying goes, one man's trash is another man's treasure. Despite its decline, this was also when the building began to gain notoriety for its dark past, with tales of ghosts, unexplained phenomena, and scary encounters becoming part of its history.
You got places like West Virginia State Penitentiary, you got Joliet Penitentiary, you got other places, Alcatraz, Santa Fe, where they had the prison riots that they closed up the state prison over there and they built a new one. All of those places have one thing in common, is that they had a lot of misery that went through there, a lot of bad things that happened there. And now those are considered some of the most haunted places in the U.S. So, to me, is that the commonality that ties all of these places together, all that misery that happened there, all that, whatever people felt, the darkness and despair that was in those places, So for me, the Doña County Jail is not just an isolated location. It's just one more to add to the list of these places where, basically when you walked in, you remember the old saying, abandon hope, all ye who enter here. That's what kind of these places remind me of.
Fast forward to today, and the jail has become a paranormal investigator oasis, with David Kreider, owner of Southwest Expeditions and the current caretaker of the jail, at the heart of it all. And that brings us to the end of part 1. I hope you've been able to stomach some of the darker moments we covered, events that, at the very least, left a mark on history. And honestly, each of these stories could be the focus of their own podcast series with how many twists and turns they take. So I hope I was able to keep things brief while still giving the history the attention it deserves. Coming up next in part 2, we shift gears to the paranormal side of the old Doña County Courthouse and Jail with David Kreider. We'll explore everything from shadow figures and disembodied voices to the mysterious death of Mary Waters, and a lot more. Plus, I'll share the spooky details from my own time at the jail while recording this podcast, including that scary, unexplainable audio I mentioned earlier. And as always, please check the show notes if you'd like to take a closer look at some of the history we covered today. I've included links to sources, photos, and other cool things to really help bring this history to life. So stick around, thanks again, and keep it weird, El Paso. Weird Tales from El Paso was produced, written, and edited by me, Adrian Mesa, with original music by Aaron Mesa. I'd like to thank all the guests of the podcast for sharing their stories and expertise with us, and for their contribution to the folklore and culture of the borderland. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like and subscribe to stay up to date on new episodes. And if you'd like to share your own experience with us, please reach out at bluelabpro.com/WTF El Paso. Thanks.